Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0. So check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. So welcome to another episode of the Market Access podcast. Today, I think we have the topic for 2025, which is joint clinical assessment. And related to that, also the early advice. And I'm very happy to have Nick Leach as one of the experts, I would say, especially in that area today as a guest. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Delighted to be here.
Perfect. And so obviously some and maybe and hopefully most of the people listening to us know you. I mean, we know each other as well, that you are, let's say, one of the key experts as well in the UK, but you have as well a much broader kind of experience, a pot of experience, obviously. So maybe just quickly introduce yourself before we can then also jump into the topic.
Absolutely. So I'm the founder and managing director of a market access consultancy called Red Thread. And we focus on straight talking access strategy, communications, and support for access, essentially. Where we spend quite a lot of our time is in the early evidence generation planning stages, all the way through to health technology assessment. So quite a lot of early dialogue and evidence generation, and then also supporting companies from a reimbursement perspective. Obviously, you mentioned, Stefan, from the UK perspective, but also increasingly looking at JCA and how to navigate those European pathways as well.
Okay, perfect. Before we maybe start with also the early advice and the benefits, maybe also the process around, I would be curious, especially as we have had a lot of more questions now in the last couple of weeks and months around the JCA itself. So for which companies does it already apply? Which kind of products? Since when? And what is just at a kind of top level, what is the process around that? Maybe we start first with that before we can then get into the early scientific advice for the JCA.
Makes complete sense. So relatively recent introduction that's been heavily trailed. So from the January this year, ATMPs and oncology products are now under a new process of JCA. So JCA is a combined assessment for all of the EU member states looking at relative clinical efficacy of your therapy, whether that's a medicinal product or a device, and essentially the incremental clinical benefit that it brings with no value judgments. So that's essentially what JCA is. It provides a number in terms of incremental clinical benefits that is then sort of provided out to the individual member states for them to do their reimbursement discussions and negotiations individually. So it's a clinical assessment, not necessarily a market access and reimbursement assessment, but it obviously heavily influences the price and ability to gain access in those individual member states once that assessment has been made.
Got you. And I mean, my understanding is obviously as well that this kind of first step, which is the JCA, is then also the base, or should be at least the basis for then the national kind of decisions, which are then obviously as well around the money, which is the reimbursement, the funding, right?
Exactly right. And I think in terms of who it applies to at the moment, as I said, ATMPs, oncology products, but it's coming for essentially everything. So there's a phase in over the next few years with ATMPs and oncology being sort of a key focus and potentially a tricky area to start, particularly when it comes to oncology, and maybe we can touch on later. Certainly looking at comparators and how you do those individual treatment comparisons, and certainly an area where joint scientific consultation could really, really help in terms of the evidence generation planning. But it's certainly something that essentially every company really needs to be aware of moving forward who wants to launch across those EU member states.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, final question before we really get into the early dialogue one: is the whole process mandatory?
Yes, you will need to go through it. Yeah, you can't avoid it. There's not really much more to add, Stefan.
Yeah, no, I just bring it up because I got the question quite often when it comes to JCA. Timelines are clear. This is Onco or ATMP or whatever, or whenever you're planning maybe a bit in advance, as you said, as well for other indications, disease areas. And then somebody's always asking the question, so is it mandatory? Can we not just get rid of it somehow? And okay, very good. So we covered that also in the podcast. So that's a good one. So
I was going to say that the only way to get rid of it is not to launch across the 23 member states, essentially. And interestingly, it's essentially an all or nothing as well, in that it is all 23 member states, can't pick and choose. Once you're in the process, the commission and the coordination group will go out to all 23 of those member states, understand what comparators, what PICOs, what assessments they essentially want to see. And then it's up to the manufacturer at that point. You can not submit for some of them, but you will need to provide strong justification. And we're yet to see how the process sort of works out. It's obviously only a few weeks in, and there may well need to be tweaks in terms of how it works moving forwards. But it's a mandatory part of the process.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Perfect. So I mean, maybe we now really try to get even a step before that, right? So we started more or less with the end a bit, right? With the reimbursement, let's say submission, the process on national level. Before that, we have the JCA. But I think the idea for today was also and especially discuss about early scientific advice. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could firstly quickly describe that kind of process. I mean, where it also fits into that overall procedure, what we have just discussed about JCA plus national reimbursement. And then thereafter, we can come obviously with some further insights around maybe benefits and first experiences, etc.
Sure. So the first thing to say, I guess, is that early advice is any advice that you get before you go for reimbursement, regulatory, because it applies to both. You can get early scientific advice for regulatory submissions and also for access submissions as well. And oftentimes they can be combined. So you can technically apply at multiple points up to the point of submitting for marketing authorization, going for reimbursement. There tend to be sort of key critical windows where it makes sense to apply. And indeed, some of the criteria for being allowed into those processes you are within this certain time point. Mm-hmm. So one of the key points is that your pivotal registrational trial protocol is not yet signed off. There's an expectation that when you go into these scientific advice processes, that there's an ability to modify the evidence generation plan that you're asking for advice on. So oftentimes you're going in and asking questions around your evidence generation. Likely as not, that's around sort of your registrational trials. And there's an expectation that the advice you're given is certainly taken into consideration when you're finalizing those protocols. There are multiple advice routes that you can take depending on where you are in the process, how quickly you want advice, who you want to talk to. And so you can start earlier and you can also start later. And that's why it's important to sort of have some guidance, I think, and to understand what you want to get out of the process when you're selecting routes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. So you touched base already. Obviously, you can have early advice from a regulatory or an access perspective. You can obviously also have it a bit combined. I mean, where I can see obviously as well individual kind of benefits, even though, let's say, the advice, what you get, let's say within that JCA procedure, that is specifically to that clinical effectiveness, what you have just spoken about in your intro words, right? It has nothing directly to do with the individual national processes, correct?
It's interesting. So the short answer is that when it comes to the joint scientific consultation, so the EU one, it's not exactly clear how that's going to be working, because they've they've changed the processes and what comes out of it. So if you look at what you can do in 2025, there's 10 slots that are open. The slots, the first application window for those slots is open at the moment. They're open at the beginning of February. So companies will be, if they haven't submitted already, will be thinking about making their submissions. And there are various areas that you can ask for advice from. The first is around your sort of clinical trial protocol. I mentioned before about sort of the registrational trial protocol that's not finalized, and getting advice on that. There's a piece around your long-term evidence generation plan and what that looks like. So sort of broader evidence collection beyond that registrational trial. And there is an optional section where you can ask health economic questions as well. So the questions, as far as we understand it, do go down to the individual member states. And there is an opportunity to ask about health economic questions within there. It's in addition, obviously, to probably the substantial number of questions that would go in on the other topics. And bearing in mind the complexities of JCA and PICOs and variations on that, my thinking is that that's probably a good area to focus on in terms of the clinical assessments. But that's not to say there isn't an opportunity to ask about the economic assessment. It'd be interested to see what comes back from the individual countries. And my suspicion is it would be more about structure of health economic models, value arguments, and what can be incorporated into sort of the value judgment consideration on an individual company basis. So there is the potential to include health economic questions, but it's an optional part of the briefing book, essentially. And to what extent you get helpful answers back, I think will start to become clear over the course of 2025.
Yeah, exactly. I think that makes also a lot of sense. I want to stick still a bit with the process. I mean, when we speak about the advice, I mean, you just mentioned as well the briefing book, which is obviously important. So how could I basically think about that briefing book? I mean, I know that obviously from a GBA's perspective, I mean, it's a quite short version with an introduction to the disease area and also with respect to the argumentation, the rationale on the question. Is that very similar from a JCA's perspective?
Yes, I think there is a lot of crossover. So we do a lot of nice early advice, for example. And the process for that is you need to apply early so that you can get into the process. I think increasingly we're seeing more gatekeeping in terms of ability to get that advice. So JSC, is a good example of that. There's only 10 slots open this year, and so they're gatekeeping that fairly heavily. I think the European Union is well aware that there are substantial grumblings around capacity. And they're looking to increase that, but it still remains that there is substantial gatekeeping. Similarly, for in-country assessments in terms of in France with us, they are becoming increasingly that they're managing capacity, and essentially it's not a gimme that you've got your budget, you go and you say we'd like to be in the process, and they say yes. There is a lot more gatekeeping than there used to be, but essentially once you're in the process. The process tends to be you write your briefing book, which is 50 or so pages, and there's, as you say, there's a piece around the unmet need. It's around the clinical development program, possibly around evidence generation plans more broadly, thinking about real world evidence incorporated in there as well. Maybe a little bit on your proposal for health economic modelling, and then importantly, it's the questions that you're asking and the company positions. So what you don't do is just ask some questions, and particularly you don't just ask fairly close questions. You have a company position and a question that comes at the end of it, because you're essentially saying our intention is to do X and Y and Z. Our considerations have been A, B, and C. Can you provide your feedback and advice on that particular approach? Once you've submitted your briefing book, there tends to be a point of clarification question. So any clarifications on your dossier, and then how the process works from that point on depends a little bit on the individual countries. But Oftentimes there is a specific meeting which the company is able to join, often in a broadly listening brief, but to answer any questions that the stakeholders in that meeting have. Sometimes it's a written report on its own. There's usually an opportunity just to clarify anything in that written report that comes out, and then that essentially closes off the process at the end of it. They can be relatively quick. I think Germany is a good example where the process can be fairly quick. It can also take from start to finish, from sort of application to finally getting the advice, 12 months, maybe sometimes a little bit longer, depending on how quickly you're able to get into the process. So I think looking at JSC as an example, that's a relatively quick process to be able to go through, because they have 2 application windows this year. They're looking to have 3, I think, moving forwards in future years, and they're looking to close those off and to have sort of the submission window fairly rapidly after that application window closes. How quickly they're able to get through that process then afterwards, I think a little bit depends on their capacity as an organization. I know that's something that they're looking to add to. It's why they only have 10 slots this year. But I don't think we'd be looking at sort of substantial timelines to get through that process. The challenge being is those slots are going to be very competitive this year.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just 2 more questions on the process. One, are the replies legally binding? And the second thing is confidentiality of the report you just made, or the reports, depending a bit on the process. Are those also confidential, meaning only applicable and obviously available also for the company?
Entirely confidential. It is advice to the company, and it's not binding. So you aren't legally bound to incorporate the advice. It's probably not a great look if you're given the advice and you completely ignore it and then go back with something which is very different later on.
Yeah, exactly. That makes probably a lot of sense. Absolutely.
Yeah. But I mean, there are practicalities. So I think, that Pharma is becoming much better at the integration across different functions at a global level, from sort of clinical and R&D, sort of evidence generation, through to pricing, reimbursement, and access. Mm-hmm. But we all know that everything that sort of pricing, reimbursement, and access asks for does not go into the evidence generation plan. And I think assessing bodies are aware of that, in that you might have tried your best to get certain things in, and it wasn't possible to do it, and then you just have to work with what you've got.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you mentioned already, let's say, some of the key benefits also from a maybe pharma perspective, I think, which is maybe especially, let's say, the kind of alignment between R&D and, let's say, pricing reimbursement, which is anyway has probably also been for quite a long time on the agenda for a lot of us, right? However, I mean, when we are thinking about, let's say, some of those timelines you mentioned beforehand, as far as I took notes, it could also be somewhere around 12 months. I mean, you would obviously, let's say, together with the only let's say limited number of slots. I mean, if it's now 10 or maybe a couple of more the next years, and we can probably just leave that as it is. But I mean, those benefits would really need to be significant if a company would really, let's say, go the path, right? So is that really making a big difference when thinking about, let's say, the kind of first end product, which is then the assessment on a JCA level before it comes to a national submission? What do you think? I mean, I know that we don't have, let's say, a lot of evidence yet, so it's a lot of feelings and understanding of the process.
Yeah. So I think 12 months is probably unusual, and that is from first contact. Mm-hmm. So you're first thinking about it and ideally sort of getting into the process. Mm-hmm. It was specifically for NICE, and I think they've tightened up their timings a little bit, because as you say, clinical development programs can't take that long to sign off protocols. Mm-hmm. Once you're into the process, it should be broadly quicker. I think some of the key benefits are essentially, it's around that integrated evidence generation planning. I think that's something which I know global teams are looking at quite closely. Mm-hmm. I think it's Abraham Lincoln, possibly misquoted, was saying, if I had 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 6 hours sharpening the axe. I see scientific advice as part of the process of sharpening the axe. It isn't the only piece, but we all know that evidence generation takes budget, it takes internal resource, and often that is potentially even more of a challenge in terms of having the people internally to be able to manage this process, even if you are using external vendors for evidence generation. I think if we use JCA as an example, you have an oncology product there. If it's second, third line, and you've got treatment sequencing going on in different therapies in different markets, different EU markets, you could be looking at a fairly substantial number of PICOs. And at that point, you're expected to do comparisons, indirect or direct, depending on your trial program, with each of those. Now, making sure that and that's not a quick and easy thing to do. You'll need to do your systematic reviews. Likely as not, you'll need to look at real world evidence. You'll need to see if you can build connected networks. All of these things take time. And what you don't want to be doing is putting energy and resource and effort into areas where you don't need to, because there's lots of things which can move the needle. Mm-hmm. I would see scientific advice as a good opportunity to align internally with cross-functional teams. I think you can hone your evidence generation plan. You won't be able to perfect it because there is no perfect evidence generation plan, but I think it would give an idea of what are the things that are going to move the needle. And I think we always look at, we often talk about early dialogue, but of which early scientific advice is a part, because there are multiple routes to be able to get the information that you need. So scientific advice is a formal route. It comes at a cost in terms of budget, in terms of resource, and in terms of time. There are informal routes to get similar information. So, for example, you could quite quickly and easily go out and conduct a series of one-to-one interviews with HCPs that would give you a fairly clear steer on what the likely comparators in individual countries would be. That means you wouldn't have to get your JSC slot, you wouldn't have to put together the dossier, but it might not have as much sort of internal heft with cross-functional stakeholders internally as a more formal JSC. So there are different ways to get the information depending on what you need. We think about that. How quickly do you want the information? What advice are you actually going for? Is it on your real world evidence? Is it on your clinical development plan? Is it on your model? You need to think about, are you at the right time to be able to get advice? Are you sort of finalizing your protocol? Have you got the resource? Are there specific stakeholders that you want to talk to? So each of these advice processes, you're talking to often overlapping stakeholders, but whether they're national level, there are some processes where you can dig down into a more sort of regional and local or sort of national level in terms of the stakeholders that you're talking to. And you also need to think whether you meet the criteria as well for some of those processes. So all of those things sort of feed into whether scientific advice is right for you, whether there are better ways of getting that same information. But in terms of the value that it brings, I genuinely think that sort of that planning what you're going to do, and you can't spend all of your time planning, obviously, you do have to spend quite a bit of time executing on those plans as well, but making sure that you're prioritizing the things which are going to move the needle by talking to the people who are going to making those decisions ultimately feels to be the right thing to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. So quite a lot of input now. I think it also shows obviously as well how to get, let's say, to the information what you finally need, which is one piece, right? One is maybe also already, let's say, early communication / management of potential decision makers on your, let's say, submission later on. I would like to maybe still put a bit of a discussion also on, let's say, small or mid-sized companies. I think you mentioned a couple of times global organization, procedure kind of thing, especially internally aligning and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, we all know that, let's say, I would generally say with most of the big pharmaceutical companies, I think they are in the meantime probably quite aligned, at least from a procedure perspective, right? What about those small and mid-sized companies? maybe especially when you would be thinking about, for example, a biotech coming from the US and then want to move over to the commercial piece, obviously in Europe. I think EMA is in the meantime, I think, quite clear. People know that. Now we have that new kind of, let's say, layer before it comes to the national one. What might be the kind of steps and maybe also alignment procedures internally which need to be happen that this is really a successful endeavor for those companies as well?
I think ultimately what everybody's driving in the direction of is making sure that the therapy can get to patients, but also making sure that something is a commercial success as well. So I think taking that commercial lens and looking at, I guess, sizes of patient populations and opportunities gives you the sense of what investment you feel that you need to make to be able to achieve that. In honesty, I would say that scientific advice, it's not the cheapest thing that you can do, but equally, it's not generally the most expensive. I think, say, if I was to look at the JSC process, for example, the actual fee that the EU charges for JSC is nothing. Like it doesn't charge it, and which doesn't mean that there's no cost to the company, obviously, for doing it, because they need to provide the resource, and probably they'll pay for a vendor to be able to put that briefing book together. But in terms of the investment to get that advice, if you can get into that JSC process, that seems to me to be a bit of a no-brainer. But what it doesn't do is probably tackle the commercial opportunity piece and the health economic assessment, and actually the sort of the pricing that you get. I think if you look at those small to mid sizes, and I sit in the UK, so I've got a bit of a UK lens on some of these things, where I see some of the value of that early advice is you have a therapy, you take it to NICE are looking for opportunities to essentially to drive down the price or to increase the size of the discount that you need to give them. And they do that by sort of hammering you with uncertainty. So the more uncertain your evidence base is, the more they'll push you down in terms of the ISA that you get. Once you've then given them that discount for the PAS and you go actually to launch in the UK, we also have now a pricing mechanism clawback, VPAG, which takes anywhere between sort of 20-25% on top of what you've already given in terms of that PAS discount, which is challenging. And so if you're looking at I would say if you're looking at that commercial opportunity as a small to medium, it's imperative that you reduce the amount of uncertainty or increase the amount of certainty within that evidence base, because that will give you a higher opportunity for achieving the price that you need within that market before you get into some of those other pricing control mechanisms. I think that's probably some of the argument that I would use in terms of making sure that that advice is sought earlier rather than later internally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're moving a bit towards the end. So looking also a bit into the future, right, where we don't have the absolute final answer. We know a bit, obviously, that let's say other indications, disease areas, and even medtech products, or let's say medical device in general, will be covered by JCA in the future. So I think that's quite clear. But when you think about the process, early advice, but also when it comes to the real, let's say, submission of the JCA documents and everything, maybe even when considering some of the national reimbursement systems in combination with the JCA, where do you see the process in 5 years' time, so by 2030? And maybe where would you potentially see changes foreseeing and or anticipating and or maybe hoping for? So what is your future, so the Nick Leach future of JCA by 2030?
So I would say what I would like to see in terms of the preparation for JCA is a good combination of some scientific advice where it's appropriate. I think discussion with in-country stakeholders sort of within pharma, essentially, because those people have got roles in those organizations because they've been there, they've done that, they've seen what the bodies in those countries will do. and also informal advice with other stakeholders in those individual markets. I think in terms of JCA, my key concern is maybe too strong a word, but sort of the area that I'm keeping an eye on is the comparators at the moment. I think that for me it brings considerable uncertainty for manufacturers, and I think if you look at the process for how the coordination group intends to survey the individual member states and then they talk about harmonizing comparators, and it doesn't look as harmonized to me as ideally we would like. I think we're going to end up with quite a confusing mess of individual comparators and patient populations, and in honesty, potentially some JCA assessments that aren't of any use to the individual countries. There's a piece in the definition of comparators which talks about individualized comparators, which means that you sort of got a basket of therapies that are all a little bit different, and you only have to compare to one. And you look at that and you think, I don't see how that's going to be of use to the countries. So I think my hope for the next 5 years would be really need to iron out some of the things that we're all looking at the process thinking, don't think that's going to work. I think there's a lot that's really good about the process. In terms of how it's actually going to work day to day, there are some real challenges that are coming up. And I think the companies that are going through those initial assessments, as well as the coordination group, because I don't think the pain will all be on one side. Mm-hmm. I think there will be some realizations that this isn't working and they're going to have to make some changes. But I think, we're all aligned with wanting to make best use of everybody's time, make use of best use of everybody's resource, and a harmonization does make sense, but we need to do it sensibly. And so clarification around the process for me is critical. And I would hope it doesn't take 5 years. I would hope we can do it considerably sooner than that. But we'll see.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe we take that last bit. It took a while, let's say a long time, until JCA really came into effect. So hopefully I would agree that those kind of, I guess, also needed kind of adjustments would not take another 5 years. I would fully agree, Nick. So I think thanks a lot for all of your insight. That was really, really helpful. I learned a lot. Hopefully also the listeners, and we're looking forward to maybe some further podcast session in the future whenever we know as well more insights from that process. Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stefan. Pleasure.
So JCA, the whole kind of process is now effective in Europe, meaning there's a joint clinical assessment after an approval by the EMA for products before they would basically need and can even submit to national reimbursement agencies. I think great insights from Nick Leach. I think when it comes to currently just, let's say, very limited number of slots available for early advice. The other thing he has as well obviously mentioned, think about your goal. So what do you want to achieve when doing such a kind of early advice? As he is well just saying, look, if you are trying to manage already and want to maybe even educate the decision makers for such a process, then maybe an early advice might also make sense. Even that for some of those, it might take for quite a long time to get through it. On the other hand, the information before and for that JCA process might also be taken from other kind of sources, such as interviews with clinicians, interviews with payers, and maybe even an advisory board in order to then also get to the comparators and their PICOs. I think what would also need to be seen is obviously the first kind of assessment, which will really happen then in 2025 and 2026, especially when thinking about the future, as we're all pretty much sure that some of the processes and some of the kind of, let's say, procedural steps might have some adjustments in hopefully the near kind of future. As Nick said already as well, there might even be some assessments without any kind of benefits for the countries of interest. I think most importantly, in any way, for all of the companies and listeners here, whenever you would be thinking to launch a product in Europe, think about the European Joint Clinical Assessment firstly, even, for example, if you're not yet part of ATMPs, oncology are just the first wave. Ultimately, in the near future, all of the product will need to go through it. So start learning about the process, ask for the right kind of process and the inputs, and also how it might be linked to the national reimbursement procedures. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.